A woman was found dead in her mansion, and at first, no one doubted it was an accident. But as time passed, more and more people noticed things that didn't add up, and the police eventually took a closer look. What they uncovered pushed the case onto the national level, grabbed the attention of millions, and, despite everything that came to light, left questions that still nag people to this day. Leslie London was born on April 26, 1951 in New York. She grew up in a large family in a quiet Long Island neighborhood. From an early age, she wanted to help people, so, after high school, she trained as a nurse and started building her career. Sometime later, she met a man named Robert Neulander, and at 33, she married him. Robert had 2 children from a previous marriage, and together, he and Leslie had a son and daughter. The family settled in a small town called Fayetteville in New York, just outside Syracuse, where Robert worked as an obstetrician-gynecologist. His career took off, and eventually he opened his own clinic. Leslie kept working as a nurse, but after their second child was born, she decided to focus on raising the kids. Over the years, she and Robert gave a lot back to their community, taking part in local charity programs, and Leslie even flew to another state to volunteer after a major hurricane. As for Robert, over his years in practice, he helped bring roughly half the town's children into the world, so the family was widely respected. By September 2012, Leslie was 61 and living a steady life. Most of her kids had moved to other cities, except for Leslie and Robert's daughter, Jenna, who was 23. On the morning of September 17th, Robert came back from his usual run, made coffee for both of them, and carried a mug into the bedroom while Leslie was in the shower, then went to wake Jenna. They were getting ready for a 9 a.m. church service, but around 8:20, when Robert returned to Leslie's room, he heard the water still running and realized she hadn't come out. He stepped into the bedroom and found his wife on the floor in a pool of blood. He immediately tried to call 911 from the phone mounted in the bathroom, but it was dead. So he shouted for Jenna and told her to call for help. Jenna called 911 from her room and told the dispatcher her mom had fallen in the shower. But, because she was on a corded landline, she couldn't go to the bathroom to see what was going on. After she gave the address, she said she was putting the phone down to check. Seconds later, the operator heard her scream that there was blood everywhere. Meanwhile, Robert pulled Leslie from the shower into the bedroom and started CPR, but nothing worked. By the time EMTs arrived, she had no pulse, and all they could do was pronounce her dead. Police interviewed Robert and Jenna about what happened and sent Leslie's body to the medical examiner's office. They learned she'd been dealing with vertigo, sudden spinning dizziness that throws off your balance, and it had been getting worse as she got older. Her relatives also said the condition ran in the family. A short time later, the pathologist ruled that she died from a fall that caused a fatal head injury, and the case was classified as an accident. So friends and family were told Leslie had slipped in the shower. But one of her closest friends, a woman named Terry, who'd once worked as a nurse in Robert's practice, started to doubt that version almost immediately. She was among the first to arrive in the house after the tragedy, and Jenna asked her to help keep the house clean because she couldn't stand the sight of her mother's blood. Jenna also asked her to make sure there were no bloodstains left in the bedroom, which struck Terry as odd. Why would there be blood in the bedroom if Leslie fell in the shower? When she stepped into the bedroom, Terry was even more surprised. There were large pools of blood on the floor and spatter on the walls and furniture, and there was so much of it that she and the housekeeper couldn't get it all out, especially from the carpet. The whole scene made her wonder if her friend had been killed, though she didn't want to believe it. She stayed with the family for the next week, turning it over in her mind, and she remembered that just days before her death, Leslie had called to say she and Robert were planning to divorce and wanted to talk in person. Only, they never got the chance. Terry didn't want to start calling it a murder on nothing more than a gut feeling, so she kept quiet for about a month. Until, she remembered that a few months before the incident, she, Leslie, and a few friends had met for their book club at a friend's house. And the book that night was about a man who killed his wife. After they'd all finished it, one of the women said they could ask her anything about the topic, because she'd been the county's chief medical examiner. That woman, Mary, had been retired for a few years, but Terry reached out anyway. After hearing her out, Mary said the murder angle sounded unlikely. Still, she advised Terry to call the police and share her concerns, just in case. In the end, Terry did. Beyond the blood in the bedroom, she flagged something else. Robert had dragged Leslie from the shower into the bedroom. Even though an experienced doctor should know you never move someone with a head injury. Detectives listened to her with more interest than she'd expected, but there was something Terry didn't know. The local police already had doubts of their own, because an anonymous letter had landed at the DA's office claiming Robert wasn't the upstanding man everyone thought, and that Leslie had been trying to leave him. Terry's mention that Leslie had planned to divorce Robert lined up with that letter, though they still couldn't trace the sender. Even so, there wasn't much they could do yet because the medical examiner's report still listed Leslie's death as an accident. Months went by like that until Mary decided to take a closer look, pushed into action by a call from Robert, his first since Leslie's death. He didn't say anything of substance, just apologized for the silence, but it brought Terry's doubts right back to mind. She contacted the district attorney and asked to see the file. Because she'd spent more than 20 years as a medical examiner, he agreed. On one condition, she wouldn't just glance at it. She'd produce a formal report with her findings as a professional. The moment Mary started going through the documents and photos, she was stunned. Leslie had a closed head injury you might see with a fall, but that was only a sliver of the picture. There were 5 separate scalp lacerations, facial wounds, and a bruise around one eye. Mary said she'd seen that combination in only 3 situations: car crashes, falls from 20 stories up, or serious beatings, not a slip in the shower. Far more likely, in her view, Leslie had been struck 1 or more times with a heavy object. Something else also jumped out. There was clear blood spatter on the walls, the side of the bed, the nightstand, even on the water bottles sitting there. But the shower, where Leslie supposedly fell, was a good distance from the bed. In the end, Mary reached a conclusion she had no doubt about. Leslie had been murdered. She took it to the district attorney, who brought in additional medical experts, and they came to the same finding. As a result, the DA opened a formal investigation, and detectives got to work. As soon as word spread that Robert was under suspicion, his children and Leslie's relatives rallied to his side, insisting he would never hurt his wife. Robert hired one of the county's top defense attorneys, who likewise declared him innocent. The problem for investigators was simple: they didn't have a single piece of hard evidence tying him to a crime. But the deeper they dug, the more red flags they found. Police confirmed Leslie had been planning to divorce Robert. She was getting ready to move into a rental and was scheduled to sign the lease the very day she died. They also learned that shortly before her death, she'd met a man named Nevin. When detectives contacted him, he said they were just friends. He was about 30 years old and they'd been messaging for a few weeks. At some point, Robert found out about it and was furious, even though the marriage was already ending. Nevin said Robert called him and demanded he stop talking to Leslie, and he also confronted Leslie about it. Some of Leslie's friends told detectives that Robert had cheated on her more than once, and Leslie knew it. On top of that, detectives learned Robert had been in serious financial trouble for years. It started when an insurance company accused him of pushing unnecessary services at his private clinic and decided he'd been overpaid by more than $1 million. He flatly denied it, and they went to court. But the insurer stopped working with him, which meant about half of his patients had to go elsewhere because their plans no longer covered the bills. He later shut down the clinic and took a hospital job that paid far less. And shortly before Leslie died, he lost that job too. Colleagues told police he had changed over the past few years. He'd become short-tempered and kept clashing with people, and some staff eventually refused to work with him. With all that in hand, detectives decided to look in the house one more time. It was April by then, 7 months after Leslie's death. Robert had already sold the place, but the new owners hadn't moved in yet, and they allowed a walkthrough without a warrant. To the forensic team's surprise, there were still visible blood traces in the bathroom and the bedroom. They also spotted dried spatter on the curtains beside the bed and on the headboard. Detectives said they hadn't seen any blood on the headboard the day Leslie died because pillows were propped there, and now they couldn't explain how her blood ended up on that spot. By Robert and Jenna's account, he first pulled Leslie out of the shower into the bedroom, then dragged her again and positioned her between the bed and the window, explaining that the bathroom was too dark and too cramped for him to start CPR. On the 911 call, you can hear Jenna yelling at her dad to stop moving Leslie, because even she knew that with a head or neck injury, you keep a person still. But, even acknowledging the fact that he dragged her toward the bed, the blood on the headboard made no sense. It suggested that at some point, Leslie was actually on the bed, yet there wasn't a single drop on the sheets. Detectives brought Robert back in for questioning, and he showed up with his attorneys, insisting that everything had happened exactly as he'd said, and that he'd never hurt his wife. As for the blood spatter in the bedroom, Robert's attorneys had explanations. First, they said, when Robert stepped into the shower and found Leslie on the floor, he was wearing a long-sleeved shirt. After he dragged her into the bedroom, the sleeves got bloody and he pulled the shirt off so it wouldn't get in the way while he tried to help her, which, they argued, could account for some of the splatter. Second, they said the EMTs could have caused it. They worked on Leslie for several minutes, so their gloves would have been covered in blood, and if they peeled them off carelessly, droplets could have flicked around the room. But detectives weren't convinced by those explanations. For starters, there was blood splatter all over the bedroom, yet none on the bed. It looked like someone had changed the sheets, and if Robert's story were true, pulling that off without Jenna, the paramedics, or the police noticing would have been almost impossible. Robert denied changing anything, but the housekeeper told officers the sheets on the bed the day Leslie died weren't the ones she'd put on the day before. The prosecutor laid out a version that tied the loose ends together. He argued Robert killed his wife hours before the supposed fall in the shower, that he attacked her in the bedroom, possibly on the bed, and struck her in the head multiple times. After that, either Leslie tried to get away and ran to the shower, or Robert dragged her there and slammed her head against the stone ledge to stage an accident. Then, the theory goes, he turned on the water and left her under the shower for hours. He went for a run, but in reality drove to a nearby lake to dump the weapon, and possibly the bedding and his bloody clothes. When he got back, he woke Jenna so that minutes later she'd call 911 and be a witness to her mother being found in the shower. After that, Robert went into the bathroom, lifted Leslie and dragged her into the bedroom to give himself a reason for the blood on the floor and walls, which would also explain why a doctor with more than 30 years of experience made the basic mistake of moving someone with a head injury. He likely meant to call Jenna only after that, so she'd first see her mother in the shower. But he didn't account for one thing. Jenna saw the blood in the bedroom before he ever pulled Leslie from the bathroom. As we know from the 911 call, she yelled, "There's blood everywhere." And at that point, she still hadn't seen her mother, which means the blood was already in the bedroom while Leslie was still in the shower. Something that doesn't fit the fall story at all. Over the next few months, detectives kept looking for more evidence, but came up empty. There was one key development, though. They brought in a bloodstain pattern analyst who said the spatter in Leslie's bedroom pointed to blows to the head, not some other scenario like falling in the shower. About a year later, in June 2014, prosecutors finally charged Robert with second-degree murder. He was arrested and released on $100,000 bail. The trial began almost a year after that. Robert and Leslie's children stood by him, as did some of her relatives. His defense stuck to the same story, a fall in the shower, and said he dragged her into the bedroom only because it was too cramped and dark to start life-saving measures in there. They also called their own expert, who testified that the available information just wasn't enough to prove a homicide. A personal trainer and Leslie's relatives told the jury she had vertigo and that it had gotten worse in recent months. The prosecution leaned on the medical findings that undercut the fall theory and pointed instead to blows from a heavy object. They noted that every injury was centered on the head. With a slip in the shower, you'd expect an elbow, a knee, or something else to be banged up too. And then there were the bruises on her face, on the opposite side from the spot she supposedly hit, raising the obvious question of where those came from. Jenna took the stand, and her testimony split the room. First, she contradicted the housekeeper and said the bedding was the same set as the day before. When the prosecutor asked if she'd seen blood in the bedroom before Robert pulled Leslie from the shower, she said no, even though her initial statements and the 911 call suggested otherwise. She also said she tried to help her father with CPR, something she hadn't mentioned before. And when you add that to the other steps she claimed she'd taken during the brief gap in the 911 call, it should have taken at least 50 seconds. Yet, she was off the line for only 13. Police tried to recreate everything she described and couldn't do it in less than 50 seconds. On top of that, Jenna testified she saw her father pull off a bloody shirt and toss it aside. But by the time police and EMTs arrived, that shirt was gone, and in the months that followed, Robert never produced it. Prosecutors said Jenna was so unwilling to accept that her father might be guilty that she talked herself into seeing the facts as proof he wasn't. Even so, the jury found Robert guilty, and in July 2015, he was sentenced to 20 years to life. Leslie's sister said she still didn't believe Robert did it and was disappointed by the verdict. Robert's children immediately hired a new attorney, known for defending mob boss John Gotti, and he began filing appeals. He soon discovered that one juror had flagrantly violated the rules by discussing the case with relatives and friends. Her own father even texted, "Make sure he's guilty." In all, about 7,000 messages were uncovered, and the defense moved for a new trial. The judge denied it at first, but 3 years later, in 2018, Robert's team got the conviction thrown out. A new trial was set, and for the next 2 years he remained free on $1 million bail. The new trial opened in the spring of 2022, and Robert's attorneys were aiming for an acquittal. What they didn't know was that the prosecution had 2 new pieces of evidence that leaned hard toward homicide. First, they sent the bed's headboard to a lab. 10 years after the killing, technicians found a tiny fragment of fatty tissue from the victim's scalp embedded in it. If Leslie had really slipped in the shower, there's no plausible way that material ends up on the headboard. But if she was struck in the head while on the bed, it makes perfect sense. The second clue had been hiding in plain sight all this time. Robert's story went like this. He woke up, went for a run by the lake, came home, made coffee for himself and Leslie, set her mug on the nightstand, and about half an hour later found her in the shower. But when the team re-examined scene photos, something jumped out. There wasn't a single drop of blood on the coffee mug, while the nightstand and the water bottles beside it were dotted with splatter. Given the direction of the droplets, the mug should have been hit along with everything else. The only way it stays clean is if the mug wasn't there when the blood hit those surfaces. In other words, it supports the prosecution's timeline. Robert killed Leslie before he ever left the house, then later brought in the coffee when there was already blood on several bedroom surfaces and her body was in the shower. He then staged it so Jenna would see him discover his wife as if she'd fallen. Then there was one more change from the first trial: motive. Back then, prosecutors didn't have a solid theory they could back up. This time, they argued Robert had learned Leslie was getting ready to move into a rental, and he knew she'd been talking with another man. Jealousy and control could have driven a violent outburst. Or, the motive was mostly financial. Robert had lost his clinic, left his job, and gone from a well-off physician to unemployed. Under New York's equitable distribution law, a divorce could give Leslie roughly half of the home's value and other marital assets. He'd likely have to sell the house and hand over a large share of the proceeds, a hit he might not have been willing to take. Thanks to those new pieces of evidence, the jury needed only a few hours to find Robert guilty, and on May 2, 2022, he received the same sentence as before: 20 years to life. Robert's children and other relatives still didn't believe he was responsible and asked the judge for leniency. Robert himself used his final statement to plead for the chance to die close to his family, rather than behind bars. But the sentence stood. His lawyers tried to overturn the verdict, yet in 2024, the appeal was denied, leaving him with virtually no path to undo the conviction or seek early release. So this high-profile, tangled case finally came to a close. Though even with 2 convictions, some people still believe Robert is innocent. Beyond his children and several of Leslie's relatives, there are plenty who followed the case and think an accident could have actually happened. And one last note, remember the anonymous letter police received days after Leslie's death? The one that cast doubt on Robert's character and first pushed investigators to question the accident narrative? Detectives tried again and again to find the author, but the sender's identity remains a mystery to this day. Share your thoughts on the story in the comments section and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video.